So thank you so much for agreeing to let us interview you today. For everyone listening, we're here with Judge Sandra Oxner of the Commonwealth Judicial Education Institute, and we are going to speak about innovation in judicial training. So for all of our listeners, could you please explain a bit about your professional background?
Yes, I studied law in Canada. I'm Canadian, and then I was a lawyer, and then I was a judge for 25 years. And in my retirement, which was in 1995, I was, before that, while I was still a judge, I was seconded to the World Bank and to help them set up their judicial education programming.
So most of the previous discussions we've had with the Global Judicial Integrity Network about artificial intelligence have been related to case management. So how can AI be implemented into judicial training programs?
Well, we continually assess and reassess what's important to study. And we realize that AI is going to be a very important part of our justice system, whether we like it or not, because of its ability to lessen opportunities for corruption, to lessen delays, which are the major source of dissatisfaction of the public with the community and throughout the Commonwealth countries, and I think from my experience with the World Bank throughout the world. But there are hazards, and we're very anxious to ensure that the justice system maintains its objective of producing a just result. So we see AI as inevitable, and we also see it as very much an aid to judicial education in the reach, but we also see that it needs to be managed. Well, with India, for example, has put 3 million cases on an algorithm, and the judges now are using that algorithm for research. Now, AI, in my view, should never be used by a judge as the complete article. It should be, your starting point. But a judge has a responsibility to make sure that the machine functioning is as good as the human would be. So we are teaching in several areas, and just developing these too. We developed a new program for this session. We want judges to generally know the capabilities and limitations of AI throughout the justice system, where it can help in case management, and this is very interesting, it has a big role to play in resolving disputes before they get to court. That will very much lessen the number of cases. The main problem that is seen now with AI is that it's, AI is only what's put into it. And if biased data is put into it, it will give that biased data out. The judge is going to have to make sure that any mechanical assistance used along the way is just. So, as I say, the judge's role is shifting. It will be to lead the way into changing the law to achieve a just result, what we call our leading cases in the common law countries, and will also have to be a supervisor. Education is a science. When I became a judge, our education was one old judge standing up and making a few comments to the new judges, and that's not very scientific education. We know there are ways to teach that achieve a higher learning result. And actually in judicial education, unlike tertiary education, perhaps generally, we're not really interested in the skills and knowledge a judge learns. We're only interested if there's a positive application of that in the judge's work. So measuring how much a judge knows doesn't tell us if judicial education has had a benefit. We have to measure whether the judge's performance positively improves. So we teach at a very high level. The most complaints against Canadian judges were that they were discriminatory in court.
I think this is a common concern.
Yes, and so for the first time ever in Canada, I think it was I think it was more specific to gender, very discriminatory. So this was in the 80s, so a long time ago. So for the first time ever in Canada, every judge had to take gender sensitivity training. I was quite put out. I thought I could teach it, but I had to take it. And I learned a lot. which is another example of just because you have a lot of knowledge, it doesn't mean that you know how to teach that knowledge. You have to learn special skills to do that. And a year and a half later, the number of complaints had dropped to like 88% based on that, to 10%. So I think now
Seems it was
maybe all we
successful.
taught was for judges not to say this.
Oh, no. I
I mean,
hope
it's
not.
very, you know, you can't really, but with AI, they could actually do an analysis of the cases and determine that. AI is going to be a tremendous help to us in assessing teaching, because you need to look at the work of the judge post-course.
So using artificial intelligence to then evaluate them after they take the course,
through
would that
through
be
analyzing their
through analyzing
cases.
their decisions? Okay, and then you could use
That's
that
a
as,
new way.
as,
We
as a
haven't done-
feedback loop. But no,
Yeah, we haven't done that yet, but we're
that's a
looking forward
potential-
to that, yes. Because we're always seeking new ways to show us whether or not there's actually been a change in performance. Sometimes it's not too hard, it's very obvious. And you can pick it up with a group discussion of court users a year later. But and it does, it's not instantaneous, it takes a while and it takes work. But most donors are now sufficiently sophisticated that they add in money for this analysis to be able to determine whether or not it had an impact.
That's very interesting. Another form of technological innovation that we've seen used a lot is e-learning, and the Global Judicial Integrity Network has incorporated e-learning into the Judicial Conduct and Ethics Training Package. Have you seen e-learning being used a lot in judicial education?
Well, e-learning is such a broad topic. If I may, I'd like to refer to the wonderful e-learning package that has gone up. That's magnificent. I really, really think that is excellent.
Good.
And it's something that we have tried to do. And we did a little machine learning session yesterday, which is a bit similar. What makes it so good? And I just, as I say, we only did one on one Bangalore principle. The one the UNODC has done is on all the Bangalore principles, which was a tremendous amount of work, because for the listener who may not be familiar, it's a test that teaches and allows you to go along from one teaching point to another teaching point, and stop and study something in the interim, and then come back and answer another question. Or if you don't get it right, you have to study it again and go on. And that's what I thought was very useful. We have had this problem. We do distance learning. We did with judicial ethics with the Delhi Judicial Academy some years ago. And we were simply overwhelmed by the amount of work it took, because we responded to each response. The problem with this kind of e-learning is that it can be boring.
I think this is another kind of one of my questions for you, is how to keep judges motivated to, either fully absorb the content of the training courses, or even to go to training courses that aren't mandatory, for instance, kind of continuous education courses. How do you motivate judges?
I'm asked that question so often. People say, we put on courses and they don't come. And I'll say, well, maybe you should look at the quality of your course, which they don't like at all. They sit down and say, thank you. But I'm really serious about that. If they're just asking a few people to get up and talk about something, who's going to go? It has to be engaging. It's almost show business. You can't rely on a speaker to be able to get up and engage people so that they continue to think about it years after the program. It sometimes happens, but you can't rely on it. So that's how we train our teachers, to spend a lot of time. For every hour in training, I would say there's 100 hours of preparation.
Oh, wow.
It's a lot of work.
I noticed in the presentation yesterday, you also used an interactive online program where people could submit responses, and then you could see
We copied yours. We copied UNODC's. We liked it so much. We use it a lot, but we make our own little variation. Yes, we did. And that's the one that I like very much, because there wasn't time yesterday. But if we were presenting it with a proper time span, they would have done the self-assessment bias test, and you would be amazed at the distinguished judges that said, I can't believe it. This thing says I'm biased. Well, that's the beginning of learning. And because of that, as an institute, and you do it as well in UNODC, you put up on your website these programs for the use of all, because judges have very hard jobs. And we like judges to lead judicial education, and they don't have time to do this kind of professional teaching on a regular basis, but we insist that's our standard, that judges have to do this. They have to be the ones to supervise. They don't have to do all the teaching, but they have to be the ones to choose and decide what to study and who will teach it. And we like to do as much work for them as we can, and that's our purpose.
So it is very important to us, that we provide things that everyone can use, because not everyone necessarily has the resources to develop things independently.
Judicial budgets give very little money to judicial education. Very little.
What about instances where courts don't have such a good access to the internet or to technology? So, for instance, we developed the self-directed course, which is an offline version of our online course. What are ways that that judicial education can be interactive without the use of technology?
I'm going to, if I may just say one more thing.
Sure.
Reach is one thing that's very deficient in judicial education. E-learning and AI will help expand the reach enormously, which is a terrific benefit. Because why should, how can we expect judges to keep up to date on their job if they're not getting some support in career day education, as I'll call it, which any old business realizes and does, and which we haven't been very good at. And judge skills are very different from legal skills. I mean, what we teach is not law. We assume our lawyers know the law or know how to find it. But for the people, there's nothing better than collegial, good education, because you're engaging people, it's interactive, you're inspiring people. It's very hard to do that with e-learning or AI-assisted learning, because they tend to be boring, as you already mentioned. And you have to build in ways to make them engaging, like a self-assessment test. And come up to somebody who will say, I don't believe this. This says I'm biased. I'm not biased. But that excites them intellectually. And things like Peter did yesterday with the 3 that engages them. Otherwise, it's pretty lonely sitting at your office or in your home at your desk, when you could be doing a lot of other more interesting things, playing with your children or whatever it is, because judicial education generally takes place after a work day, which is pretty arduous for a judge. And it has to be good enough to compete with other things for attention. So.
So perhaps you were mentioning collegiality, perhaps group exercises, this kind of thing, if technological aids aren't available.
Just good basic education. All the things we did before these came along, that is AI and e-learning are not necessarily going to give us superior results. They give us reach. We can reach more people. It's much easier when you're together. There's nothing like human interaction to inspire change. That's a human quality, that we are capable of being inspired by other humans. We're capable of being inspired by great literature, and we use that in our teaching. And that's a good e-learning mechanism, to get people to read a book that will inspire them and then discuss it. But you always have to look, in my mind, at e-learning from the point of view of trying to make it as good as collegial, which is, in my mind, and I've had 49 years of experience, the results you get from collegial, carefully created and directed learning give you a lot more value for your money than anything else. But we don't have the reach.
Right.
What you have done, and yours is very good, and you will have successes because you have built in things that will alleviate the boredom. Lawyers are not, lawyers are trained to look to precedent. That's going to have to change. But the good lawyers have always looked to do justice, and they won't allow a lack of precedent to prevent that in the good judges. But we're we're not communicators, and yet that's a very important requirement for a judge. So you need to bring in communicators to teach the judge. You need to look at the judicial role and decide what needs to be taught. And then our problem has always been, you can put on a great program for 30 people, but what if there are 300,000 judges?
Right,
But
which is the benefit of the technology.
That's what you have been able to do. You've been able to create a program which has tremendous reach, and I'm sure you'll keep improving it. A great deal of fun and joy in my life has been judicial education. In the common law countries, where education for judges is not specific, education is done by groups of judges who are interested, usually quite intellectual of the judges, and we have such fun and we become wonderful friends. So I always encourage young judges to get involved in judicial education for the collegiality, for the fun, and for the intellectual stimulation.
But
we have fun, is my point.
Of course, the network, this is also something that we're trying to foster, is a sense of community so that judges can reach out to each other if they have questions.
And they will do it.
So
they will do it.
It's good to hear that it's been a successful approach for you and enjoyable.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed our little talk.
Yes, thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us.
My pleasure.
And for everyone listening, stay tuned for more episodes in the Global Judicial Integrity Network podcast series. Thank you.